Welcome to Focus Heavenward Ministries. The last few months, we've been studying Proverbs 2 together. And as we're nearing the end of summer, we're also rounding the corner to the end of Proverbs 2 with only 3 verses left in this chapter. So let's get started. The preceding verses in Proverbs 2 warned us of the consequences of not following God's wisdom. Now, with these last 3 verses in Proverbs 2, we are given a charge in verse 20, a promise in verse 21, and with the final verse, we're given a warning. Today, though, we'll be concentrating on verse 20, which reads, "So you will walk in the way of good men and keep to the paths of the righteous." Before we start digging in to verse 20, we need to back up to the beginning of Proverbs 2 for just a moment. There are a conditional set of actions with a consequence listed for us in verses 1 through 5. It starts with, "If you receive my words and treasure my commandments within you. If you make your ear attentive to wisdom and incline your heart to understanding. If you cry for discernment and lift your voice for understanding. If you seek wisdom as silver and search for wisdom as for hidden treasure, then," this is the result, "you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God." We are then reminded that the source of wisdom is God. In Proverbs 2, 6 through 8, the next few verses, it states the qualities, power, and results of following God's wisdom. We read that knowledge and understanding come from God's mouth. He stores up sound wisdom for those who follow him, and God is a shield to those who walk in integrity. He also protects the paths of justice, and he preserves the way of those who follow him. Moving on to verses 9 through 11, we were given additional results of following wisdom. It said, "Then you will discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course, for wisdom will enter your heart and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will guard you. Understanding will watch over you." We moved forward in verses 12 through 15, which turned our focus to a description of the way of evil, or those who reject God's wisdom. It told us that they are those who speak perverse things, who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who delight in doing evil and rejoice in fraud, mischief, and wickedness. Their ways are crooked and devious. And finally, the last study we did in Proverbs 2, verses 16 through 19, we were made aware of a very specific description of one of evil's snares, and that was of the strange woman or the adulteress who uses flattery, forsakes righteousness, and forgets the covenant of her God. We read that her end and those who follow her is death. So moving on, Proverbs 2, verse 20 reads, "So you will walk in the way of good men and keep to the paths of righteousness." You can almost hear the psalmist pleading in this verse. It's like he's saying, do not fall into this destruction that was warned. Follow wisdom instead. Heed to the instruction given in verses 1 through 11 and avoid the evil described in verses 12 through 19. This is what you need to do. Can't you hear that? You will then walk in the way of good men and keep to the paths of the righteous. So here we are given a charge. When we think of walking, we are propelling ourselves somewhere. This is the most common physical way of getting from one point to another. Yet in this case, walking also means to be led or to follow the lead of another. Remember what Proverbs 2:20 says. It says, "So you will walk in the way of good men." Heeding God's wisdom will point us towards those who have followed him. They are our examples. God has been gracious to us in many ways. One of the many blessings we have is the example of others who have persevered for him. There are numerous written accounts of righteous men and women in the Bible. There are also godly examples around us now of those who are striving to follow truth. We see action to follow in Proverbs 2:20. Listen again, it says to walk in the way and to keep to the paths. This is a movement towards and a path to pursue, and it is purposeful. In other words, we do not begin walking and then see where we end up. This is not a meandering adventure with no particular intention or plan. Instead, as we walk, we are to carefully regard and protect the manner of righteousness seen in those before us. God has given us his wisdom and examples. Therefore, we are to follow them. One commentary says this: follow the counsels and examples of the godly, whereby he, Solomon, intimates that it is not sufficient to abstain from evil company alone and practices, but that we must also choose the conversation of good men. In other words, it's not enough to just not do the things that are wrong. We must also actively pursue to do the things that are right. Consider these questions for personal application. Who or what have you chosen to follow? Are you purposeful in your direction? Do you strive to follow the examples of godliness only when it is convenient or easy? Are you willing to give up your own direction and desires in order to choose God's direction and his righteousness? Let me suggest these additional scriptures for encouragement and reminder. In fact, you may want to jot the references down so that you can visit them later in your own study. Proverbs 13:20 reads, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." Psalm 119:63 says, "I am a companion of all those who fear thee and of those who keep thy precepts." Psalm 119:115 reads, "Depart from me, evildoers, that I may observe the commandments of my God." And Jeremiah chapter 6 verse 16 says, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the ways and see and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you shall find rest for your souls." But they said, this is the answer of this command: we will not walk in it. That's the opposite of what we want to say. 3 John chapter 1 verse 11 reads, Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. The one who does good is of God. The one who does evil has not seen God. Hebrews chapter 6 verses 11 and 12 reads, And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end, that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Next week, we will look at Proverbs 2:21 and the promise it holds for those who seek to follow God. In the meantime, keep your focus heavenward until we meet again.